Welcome everyone. You have made it to the last chapter of Anatomy and Physiology 1. Give yourself a round of applause. Go ahead. Now we can't rest too much because we still have to cover this chapter and we still have the final exam, but the end is in sight, folks. Excellent. All right, so the autonomic nervous system. This is our last chapter of the nervous system. So if you remember, we had the nervous tissue where we talked about the structure of a nerve cell and how an action potential is generated. Then we had the central nervous system. Then we had the peripheral nervous system. And our final chapter is the autonomic nervous system. This is not that long of a chapter, but it's really important. And it's also a little conceptual. So it's not as much about memorizing where this is, where that is. There's some memorization, but it's not all about memorization. My goal is to have you understand the whole concept, a little bit more abstract. But if you stick with me, we should be able to do it. All right, so here we are, back to our good old nervous system chart. We talked about the central nervous system. We had a whole chapter on it. We had a whole chapter on the peripheral nervous system. You may recall the peripheral nervous system is made up of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. The spinal nerves are the nerves that run through our body and arms and legs, which are all the nerves outside of our brain and spinal cord. And of all those peripheral nerves outside of our brain and spinal cord, some are sensory. You know this by now. Come on. Say it with me. Say it before I even say it. The sensory nerves send information from the body to the spinal cord and brain. And then we have motor nerves. And our motor peripheral nerves send information from the brain and spinal cord out to the body. We are going to focus only on these motor peripheral nerves. So for this chapter, we're going to forget about the sensory peripheral nerves. We're going to forget about, for the most part, the central nervous system. We are focusing only on the motor nerves in the periphery. And I'm spending a lot of time with this because, I mentioned this chapter is kind of abstract. And I think a really good place to really start to get a handle on this is what we're looking at specifically. And we're only going to be looking at the motor nerves, the peripheral nerves that are sending nerve impulses from the brain spinal cord out to the body. Now we're going to even further simplify this. We may remember I introduced this in the chapter on the reflexes in the peripheral nervous system. If, for example, if the effector of a reflex goes to skeletal muscle, it is said to be somatic. Remember that? So we can expand that definition. And it's not just reflex effectors, it's every muscle. Anytime a motor nerve goes to skeletal muscle, anytime a motor nerve goes to skeletal muscle, it is said to be somatic. However, what we are going to talk about in this chapter is the autonomic motor nerves, which by process of elimination and by the word automatic, tells us that these are going to be motor nerves that go into smooth or cardiac muscle. Okay, so this chapter is dealing only with the peripheral motor nerves that are innervating or supplying skeletal and cardiac muscle. That's it, folks. So if you could start there, it'd be a dream. I'd be very happy if we could at least get that to start with. We are looking only at the motor nerves that supply or innervate cardiac and smooth muscle. And these are involuntarily controlled That's why they're considered autonomic motor nerves. We already talked about the the somatic motor nerves. What's there to say? We voluntarily send a nerve impulse from our primary motor cortex, goes to the skeletal muscle, contracts. So there's really nothing more to say, but there's so much more to say about these motor neurons that go to our smooth and cardiac muscle. And the reason why there's so much to say is because these are the motor nerves that control and regulate our vital organs. And that's what we're going to find out is pretty much the definition of the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is the grouping of motor nerves that go to smooth and cardiac muscle and regulate and control all of our vital organs. Let me say that again. The autonomic nervous system is all of those peripheral motor nerves that go to our smooth and cardiac muscle. And the autonomic nervous system is how we control and regulate the nerve impulses that go to smooth and cardiac muscle. Because by the way, smooth and cardiac muscle, well, cardiac muscle is our heart, and smooth muscle lines all of our other vital organs. Smooth muscle lines our digestive tract. Smooth muscle lines our airways. Smooth muscle lines all the blood vessels that feed all of our organs, right? There's smooth muscle in the ureters that pump freshly made urine to the bladder. So the autonomic nervous system is made up of these peripheral motor nerves that supply smooth and cardiac muscle. And the autonomic nervous system function is to control and regulate all of our vital organs via these nerves. Okay, folks, so if you could just somehow find a way to get that into your brain in some statements that make sense to you. So I've already said this, but here are some other words and phrases that might help you. So if we look at the structure, so what is the structure of the autonomic nervous system? The structure of our autonomic nervous system is all the peripheral motor neurons that supply smooth and cardiac muscle. So we're only looking at motor nerves, not sensory, and we're only looking at motor nerves that go into smooth and cardiac muscle, not skeletal. And then what is the function? So the function of our autonomic nervous system. The function, you can read here, helps to maintain normal body functioning in organs of the viscera. Controls, regulates our vital organs. Controls and regulates our vital organs, both in our thoracic and in our abdominopelvic cavity. There couldn't be much more important than that, right? Excellent. Okay, so how do these motor nerves control and regulate our vital organs? You know what, folks? Reflexes. Not somatic reflexes, because somatic reflexes, the goal was protection, and somatic reflexes, the effector was skeletal muscle. So we're talking about the same reflex loop, but instead of its function being for protection and the effector being skeletal muscle in the autonomic nervous system, it's the same reflex loop, but we're supplying smooth and cardiac muscle, and the goal is to regulate our organs. So that's why you see the word visceral here as opposed to somatic. Somatic would tell us that these reflex arcs would be innervating skeletal muscle, but visceral means inner. So we're talking about the effector of visceral reflexes being smooth or cardiac muscle. I've got some examples on a slide. Let me use this example. I think this is a better one. So it's the same reflex arc. You already know this reflex arc, and that's why we cover things in this order. See, it's by design. I kind of know what I'm doing. We have some kind of stimulus, and then there's a sensory nerve impulse that goes to the spinal cord and also up to the brain for processing. And then as a result of that processing, we send out a motor nerve to an effector. In this case, the effector is going to be smooth or cardiac muscle. And the autonomic nervous system is really focusing on this half, right? On the motor neuron and the effector. Of course, the autonomic nervous system is going to get more complicated than what we're going to talk about. But in a lot of ways, it's quite simple. And it's beautiful in its simplicity. So let's give an example of how an autonomic nervous system visceral reflex loop might work. Or in other words, give an example of how the autonomic nervous system works. Well, there's some kind of stimulus. So the stimulus is you just brought in food, right? So there's sensory receptors in your taste buds. There's sensory receptors in your nose that smell the food. There's sensory receptors in your stomach that receive that food within, it only takes 5-10 seconds to get that food from your mouth down to your stomach. And then there's processing. So we have sensory nerve impulses from our stomach. We have sensory nerve impulses from our nasal cavity. Donut smells good. And then there's processing in the spinal cord and brain. So if we remember, the hypothalamus of the brain is the satiety center. I didn't have you know that, but it was on the PowerPoint. The hypothalamus is the part of the brain that regulates hunger. So the brain is going to get these sensory signals that say, oh, we just ate food. It's going to process that and say, oh, we need to release some enzymes. So then there's going to be a motor, let me put it in red here. I just got excited, I banged the screen. There's going to be a motor impulse to the smooth muscle of the stomach to start the stomach wall to churn, and also to cause release of enzymes. Well, guess what? This part right here is the autonomic nervous system. Of course, we have to have these to get there, but there's some kind of stimulus that goes to the brain, and then the brain processes and sends out a motor impulse to smooth or cardiac muscle to tell the body what to do. If you just ate, then the autonomic nervous system is going to send impulses to the stomach to tell the stomach wall to churn. The autonomic nervous system is going to send nerve impulses to your pancreas to release digestive enzymes. It is a reflex loop. There's some kind of stimulus, information gets back to your brain processes, and then it tells the smooth and cardiac muscle what to do. It is as simple as a reflex arc. Man. Love it. Okay, so make sure that you spend time on this beginning part, what we just talked about. It is a little bit abstract. I'm not saying that to scare you, but I'm saying it so you give it enough time. Somehow put it into your own words, When I put this into my own words, I think about, okay, autonomic nervous system. What is it made up of? Okay, the autonomic nervous system is made up of our peripheral motor nerves that go to smooth and cardiac muscle. All right, okay. What is the function of the autonomic nervous system? The function of the autonomic nervous system is to regulate and control all of our vital organs, right? The ANS regulates and controls all of our vital organs. Involuntarily, of course. Well, how does it do it? Through reflexes. Only it's visceral reflexes that are going to be involving smooth and cardiac muscle as an effector. Yeah, so the body, the organs have all sorts of things going on all the time. And we have sensory receptors that send information about these organs to the brain. The brain processes and is going to send out nerve impulses to smooth and cardiac muscle to do what has to be done. That is the autonomic nervous system. Now, we are going to get a little bit more specific about the structure. And we're going to talk about the structure as well as a little bit more of the function in terms of our two divisions. I know you've heard of these before. Our autonomic nervous system has two modes. It really has our sympathetic mode or our parasympathetic mode. And we tend to be in either one or the other. That's it. Okay? Our sympathetic mode, as we're going to talk about, is our fight or flight. So anytime your body is under stress, it could be emotional stress. You have a big final exam coming up in a certain course. You had a breakup in a relationship. It could be physical stress. Someone's having a heart attack. It could be physical stress that is good, like exercise. Exercise is a healthy stress to the body. Well, anytime our body's under stress, our autonomic nervous system goes into this sympathetic mode. On the other hand, whenever we are at rest, and sometimes the parasympathetic mode is called resting and digesting, whereas the sympathetic is our fight or flight. Whenever we're at rest, resting and digesting, our autonomic nerves go into a parasympathetic mode. So we're going to talk about the structure and function more detailed through these two modes. Okay, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Before we do that, I just wanted to review. We already talked about somatic and autonomic nerves. This is really a review. Somatic nerves are nerves that innervate skeletal muscle. Right? Somatic nerves innervate skeletal muscle. Autonomic nerves innervate smooth and cardiac muscle. We're focusing on the autonomic. I did make a point here that in these nerve bundles, right? So we know that all the peripheral nerves come in bundles, and then in each bundle are individual axons. Well, the somatic and the autonomic nerves are in the same bundle. So what I'm coloring as red might be our autonomic nerves, and what I'm coloring as green might be our somatic nerves, which just means that if I'm coloring in one of these axons green, the end point of that axon motor nerve is going to be a skeletal muscle. If I'm coloring one in red, the end point of that motor neuron is going to be smooth or cardiac muscle. But again, they're all in the same bundles. But within each bundle, each individual axon is only going to go to one place, either skeletal muscle or smooth or cardiac. All right. We're going to talk about some of the structure of the autonomic nervous system. So we're focusing on autonomic. Now remember, autonomic stimulates cardiac and smooth muscle. Review. Even though we're not talking about somatic in this chapter, I still want to review this because we did talk about it in the peripheral nervous system chapter. Don't forget, somatic nerves innervate skeletal muscle. Now we're going to add in some more structure. A somatic nerve is what we're most familiar with in that It's a one neuron chain. What that means is you have a nerve cell body, you have one axon, and it goes to a skeletal muscle. It is one nerve. What we're going to find out in the autonomic nervous system, we have a two neuron chain. So we have our first nerve, and then we're going to have a second nerve before it gets, let's say it's cardiac muscle of the heart. But notice, in an autonomic nerve, which is going to go on to stimulate smoother cardiac muscle, we have not just one nerve in the periphery, but two. So it's a two neuron chain. And also what's different is the neurotransmitters that are released. We already know, see, a lot of this you already know, my friends. What is the neurotransmitter released from nerves in a skeletal muscle? Acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is really only going to excite a muscle. However, in our autonomic nerves, we can release multiple neurotransmitters. And usually the two we talk about are acetylcholine and norepinephrine. You might see norepinephrine shortened as NE. And these can be either excitatory or inhibitory. All right, great. So you're going to compare these differences. We already know the things about somatic. It's a nerve that innervates skeletal muscle. It's only a one neuron chain, and the neurotransmitter that is released from the nerve into skeletal muscle is acetylcholine. Now we're introducing the autonomic motor nerves, which are the motor nerves that are going to innervate or supply smooth and cardiac muscle. Instead of being just one nerve, we have two nerves. It's a two neuron chain. And instead of just releasing acetylcholine, we can also release norepinephrine. All right, my fine friends. Let's see. I want to come back to the function. I don't like to jump around, but I am, in the words of Criss Cross. What? Jump, jump, jump around. That's a terrible song. Plus they wore their clothes backwards. But when I was a little 12-year-old, coolest thing. All right, so I want to start talk with the structure. So we're talking about the structure of the autonomic nervous system. And we're going to talk about three things that relate to the structure. Where these nerves leave the spinal cord, how long each nerve is. Remember, there's a two neuron chain, so we'll discuss the length of each of those neurons. And then we're going to talk about where the ganglia is. Remember, a ganglia is a cell body outside of central nervous system. Because we have a two neuron chain, so we have one cell body, and this is going to be in the CNS, leading to an axon, but then we have another cell body in the periphery. So we have our first nerve, our preganglionic nerve, and our second nerve, our postganglionic nerve. The cell body outside of the central nervous system is called a ganglion, or ganglia for plural. The initial cell body is in the central nervous system. But then we have one axon coming out from it into the periphery. But because we already know that autonomic nerves have a two neuron chain, then we have to have a second cell body. And because that second cell body is outside of the central nervous system, it is considered to be a ganglion. So another difference we'll talk about is where this ganglion is located. All right, so we're going to go it one by one, go through it one by one. At the end, we have two separate summaries. This is a pretty decent summary, but I also have it here. All right, let's first talk about the sites of origin. Okay, if we look at this picture, we're going to start to use colors. We're going to use purple for parasympathetic, and then we're going to use, let's use a darker green, easier to see. Use green for sympathetic. Let's first talk about sympathetic. Our sympathetic autonomic nerves. And again, we're just talking about the motor nerves to smooth and cardiac muscle. If it is a sympathetic motor nerve to a smoother cardiac muscle, it will leave the spinal cord in the middle. See that? So in the middle of spinal cord. Technically, it's the thoracolumbar region. So in the thorax, thoracic region, and lumbar region. So our sympathetic motor nerves that innervate smooth and cardiac muscle leave the spinal cord in the middle of the spinal cord, which means that our parasympathetic nerves leave at the top and very bottom. Top, bottom. That's all you need to know. Our sympathetic autonomic nerves leave the spinal cord in the middle of the spinal cord, thoracic and lumbar regions. But our parasympathetic nerves, leave the spinal cord at the very top and the very bottom. And you can see that in the picture, right? All the purple parasympathetic are leaving the spinal cord very high and very low, and all the green or sympathetic are leaving in the middle. Right? So we can see that here. Origin. Sympathetic leaves in the middle of spinal cord. Parasympathetic, top and bottom of spinal cord. These, my friends, are just memorization, which some of you may like. Let's next talk about the length of the fibers. Let me remind you, we have a pre-ganglionic neuron and a post-ganglionic neuron. This is in the CNS. We have our first nerve, and then because it's an autonomic nerve, we have a second nerve. So we're going to talk about the length of these pre-ganglionic nerves, and post-ganglionic nerves. All right, back to our colors. Let's do parasympathetic first. And we're using purple because in this diagram, the parasympathetic nerves are purple. The parasympathetic nerves have a very long preganglionic nerve and a very short second or very short postganglionic. The ganglia is this little circle doohickey. So all the circles are actually in the effector. So in parasympathetic, we've got a very long preganglionic and a very short postganglionic. The opposite is true of sympathetic. We have a relatively short preganglionic and a longer postganglionic. So if we were to draw that out, sympathetic, let's erase this. Sympathetic would be a short preganglionic nerve and a long postganglionic nerve, versus a parasympathetic has a long preganglionic nerve and a short postganglionic nerve. Parasympathetic has a long preganglionic nerve and a short postganglionic nerve. Sympathetic has a short pre and a long post. When you're memorizing these, have you ever thought about just memorizing one and then the other is the opposite? Right? So if I just memorize sympathetic, parasympathetic nerves originate in the middle of the spinal cord, and parasympathetic has a short pre and long post. If I memorize one, then the other is just the opposite. Well, if the sympathetic nerves leave in the middle of the spinal cord, then the parasympathetic nerves leave the top and bottom. So it may cut your work in half. And then lastly, we have the ganglia location. And because we remember the lengths of the nerves, this makes sense. Remember, a parasympathetic has a long preganglionic and a short postganglionic. So where is the ganglia going to be? Remember, a ganglion is a cell body outside the central nervous system. These circles. In the parasympathetic nervous system, the ganglion, or the cell body of the postganglionic nerve, is pretty much in the effector, or it's very close to it. On the other hand, because sympathetic has a short preganglionic and a long postganglionic, where's our ganglia going to be here? Close to the spinal cord. So here we can see, for example, our ganglion, our cell body of the postganglion is closer to the spinal cord. Excellent. So lastly, we see a sympathetic, the ganglion is close to the spinal cord, and then in parasympathetic, it is in or near the effector. And I actually like this diagram. I think it does a really good job. It shows you the somatic nervous system, which is not part of this chapter, but it's a good review. Somatic nervous system nerves innervate skeletal muscle. The neurotransmitter released is acetylcholine, and it is a one neuron chain. On the other hand, our autonomic nervous system innervates smooth and cardiac muscle and has a two neuron chain. In the sympathetic nerves, we have a short preganglionic and a long postganglionic. In the parasympathetic, we have a long preganglionic and a short postganglionic. And of course, in the somatic nervous system, we are only going to release acetylcholine, but in the autonomic, it can be norepinephrine sometimes, or it can also be acetylcholine sometimes. Good stuff, my friends. All right, let's go back to function. We have two modes, and I really like that word mode, because at any given point in time, we're in either one or the other. That's not to say that we have 100% sympathetic and 0% parasympathetic. That's not realistic. But at any given time, one mode is the majority. Right now, I'm guessing you are in a parasympathetic mode. I'm guessing you're not exercising. I'm guessing you're not in extreme stress. I hope not. So anytime that we are resting and digesting, when we are at rest, we are considered to be in a parasympathetic mode. On the other hand, anytime that we are under stress, it is said to be a sympathetic mode. It doesn't have to be bad stress. Sometimes there is bad stress, you know. Everyone, when they teach this, they seem to go to the worst case scenario. Oh, a bear is chasing you in the woods. A robber's trying to rob you. Hell yeah, you're going to be in a sympathetic fight or flight. But the stress could also be anxiety before an exam. The stress could also be excitement about someone visiting you. Stress could also be exercise. And, really important point, every organ is innervated by both sympathetic and parasympathetic. So if we have, for example, if we have the heart, and all of us have a heart, the heart is going to receive both. It's going to receive sympathetic nerve impulses, but it's also going to receive parasympathetic nerve impulses. And notice, my friends, because the sympathetic nerves leave in the middle of the spinal cord, I put the sympathetic kind of in the middle. And because parasympathetic leave the spinal cord at the very top and very bottom, I put this one at the bottom. So every organ has both sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves going into it. But whichever there is more of, that will be the response. So if I am under stress, I may be sending 100 sympathetic nerve impulses and only 10 parasympathetic. So the overall result is going to be sympathetic. Okay? All right. And, you know, this picture is trying to show you that because they have the heart here and they have the heart here. It's kind of a weird way to do it because we don't have two hearts. But they're just showing you that this is what the parasympathetic nerve to the heart would look like. This is what the sympathetic nerves to the heart would look like. Every organ is going to receive both. All right. Everyone probably knows about our sympathetic nervous system. This is the mode that we send nerve impulses down more often when we're under stress. And when we are under stress and we activate or send nerve impulses down these sympathetic motor nerves, we will increase heart rate and blood pressure and respiratory rate. And at the same time, we are decreasing GI and renal function. So, if we are in a if we're in a sympathetic mode, we will see we will activate nerve impulses to increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, increase respiratory rate. And at the same time, we will send less nerve impulses to our GI tract and our kidneys. And this is by design, folks. When we are under stress, this is meant to help us handle the stress. If someone's got a gun pointed at me, I do want to have my heart rate increased so I can send more blood to my muscles so I can run away. That's the idea, right? This will get more blood to your skeletal muscles to allow you to either fight or flight. When someone's got a gun to my head, you know, I really don't care about filtering my blood for urine as much. I really don't care about digesting this morning's bagel. You know, your body has only so many nerve impulses to give. So we have to have these modes. We can't be giving a lot of nerve impulses always to every organ. That would be inefficient. So when we're in a sympathetic state, when we're under stress, the autonomic nervous system will automatically send more sympathetic nerves, which will increase heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and decrease your kidney and GI function. All for the idea of allowing you to handle that stress. On the other hand, the other mode is parasympathetic, which is our resting and digesting. And this is going to pretty much be the opposite. When we're in a parasympathetic mode, we increase GI and renal activity. And at the same time, we decrease heart rate, blood pressure, and respiratory rate. When we're resting and digesting, if we're at rest, I don't need to increase my heart rate. I'm not doing anything. This is precisely the time when we can afford to send more energy and more nerve impulses to our kidneys and our digestive tract. There are, of course, some nuances between sympathetic and parasympathetic. But these are the basics. And it's pretty amazing how effective it can be, because we have these two modes. Either we need to prepare ourselves for stress, or we can be in a more relaxed state and catch up on digesting our food and filtering our blood to make urine. Pretty cool. This gives you some more specifics. You don't need to know the specifics. It's just there if you're interested. Okay, couple other loose ends, and then there's not really that much left of this chapter. When we compare sympathetic and parasympathetic, we can see some differences. Sympathetic tends to have longer term effects. So when we increase heart rate, blood pressure, and respiratory rate, these sympathetic nerves can be quite powerful, and they can keep our heart rate elevated for a bit longer than the effects of our parasympathetic would. And the sympathetic effects are more widespread. And these are both beneficial. And by the way, that's the benefit of having, in the sympathetic, that's the benefit of having the ganglia close to the spinal cord, because you can send a really short preganglionic nerve impulse, and then you can send that out to a bunch of postganglionic nerves very quickly. And all this is to say that the parasympathetic has effects that are a little bit shorter, and the effects are a little bit more local. And that's okay. So make sure you know those differences. I'm going to come back to referred pain. Let's talk about these neurotransmitters. We already know, and I see a misspelling here, acetylcholine, should be an L in there. We already know that in the autonomic nervous system, we're going to release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. We already know that the effects of these can be either excitatory or inhibitory. I've already introduced to you the terms cholinergic and adrenergic. Cholinergic is any nerve ending or receptor that receives, any nerve ending that releases or receptor that receives acetylcholine. Remember I said cholinergic C with acetylcholine. And an adrenergic is any nerve ending that releases or any receptor that receives norepinephrine. We tend to see patterns. Is there a picture? Yeah, not yet, but okay. We tend to see patterns where all preganglionic nerves release acetylcholine. So remember, we have our first nerve and our second one. This is saying that all of the preganglionic nerves release acetylcholine. However, the postganglionic nerves may release acetylcholine if it's parasympathetic, or may release norepinephrine if it is sympathetic. You don't need to know these specifics. I think you have enough to know. I'm just pointing out that at different preganglionic and postganglionic, sympathetic versus parasympathetic, at these different locations and different modes, we can see release of different ones. What you need to know is the overall. And what that is what I'd like you to remember is that in the autonomic nervous system, our neurons may release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. That these neurotransmitters, acetylcholine and norepinephrine, can be either excitatory or inhibitory. And you should also review that a cholinergic nerve ending releases acetylcholine. Cholinergic acetylcholine. Whereas adrenergic releases norepinephrine. This is all extra. We can really break this down more specifically. So if we look at our sympathetic nerves, we can have different types of receptors, either alpha or beta. You might see this when it comes to medications, how they're named, but you don't need to know this. With our parasympathetic, our subreceptors are nicotinic and muscarinic, but you don't need to know those either. Here are some more examples of medications and how we can manipulate what we know about these neurotransmitters. You don't need to know any of these. Pretty interesting. Albuterol is a great example, but you don't need to know it. I've already talked to you about this, that we have something called dual innervation. And dual innervation just means that all of our organs are going to receive both sympathetic and parasympathetic. However, when we are in more of a sympathetic mode, we're going to be sending more nerve impulses down sympathetic. When we're in a parasympathetic mode, we will send more nerve impulses through the parasympathetic. Additionally, you can see here at the bottom, we have something called a tone. And all that means is even at rest, we're going to have some activity in our sympathetic. Even when we're under stress, we're going to have some activity in our parasympathetic. So in other words, there's always going to be a little bit of activity in these all the time. Obviously, when we're under stress, there'll be much, much more sympathetic nerves, but still a couple parasympathetic. Okay, so we have what's called a tone. We tend to refer to this tone with sympathetic nerves, but I'm not going to be that specific. So for this tone, just understand that no matter what, there's always going to be a little bit of activity in sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. Okay? No matter what, there's always going to be some activity in sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. Okay, 2 more things to talk about, my friends, and then we are done. One of them is overall control of the autonomic nervous system. We know that the autonomic nervous system is made up of our peripheral nerves that are motor, and our motor peripheral nerves that are innervating only skeletal and smooth muscle. We got that. But let me go back. We know that how the autonomic nervous system functions is through reflexes, that the brain is receiving input from our vital organs, and then our output to the smooth and cardiac muscle of our vital organs helps to regulate and control them. But what part of the brain is really most responsible for coordinating those reflexes? Well, it's a little bit more complicated because we are going to be using some parts of the spinal cord. We are going to be using some parts of the brainstem. And we're also going to be using some emotions, which of course is going to involve our cerebral cortex as well. But if we had to narrow it down to one part of the brain that had the most to do with controlling the autonomic nervous system, it would be the hypothalamus. So even though we're using other parts of the brain to oversee these autonomic nerves, right? Even though we're using other parts of the brain to help in functioning these autonomic nerves, the hypothalamus is what is most in charge. And I gave you an example with the stomach, the reflex with our stomach after we eat. Sensory nerves from our stomach wall come back to our brain to tell us we just ate, and there's going to be an autonomic motor response to the smooth muscle of our stomach wall and help it contract, for example. Well, the hypothalamus is our satiety center, so it's going to be overseeing our gut. And the hypothalamus is really involved in a lot of the autonomic nervous system. So we're going to say, which part of the brain is most active in regulating our autonomic nervous system? Hypothalamus. I'm going to go back to one last thing. And I'm going to cherish this, my friends, because it's the last slide of the semester. And it deals with referred pain. Everyone's heard of referred pain. If someone's having a heart attack, they may have pain in their left arm. Well, why is that? If the problem is really in my heart, why do I have pain in my left elbow? There's all sorts of referred pain. People with a heart attack can have jaw pain. People with liver problems can sometimes have pain on their right shoulder. It's called Kerr's sign. So what is it with referred pain? And the answer goes back to those nerve bundles, right? Remember we had those nerve bundles? I'm a really bad drawer. So in a bundle of nerves, let's go back to our original colors. Well, we'll use different colors. Let's use orange. So we're going to use orange for sensory nerve. And then we'll use green for motor. And because we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, these are going to be autonomic nerves, autonomic motor nerves. Well, in each bundle, we have both motor nerves, which are sending information from the brain out to the body, and we're going to have sensory nerves that send information from the body back to the brain. Well, sometimes these pathways are shared and our brain can get confused. Let's use the heart as an example. Okay, so here's our heart, right? Let's just say that we're talking about a bundle of nerves from our heart to the brain. Well, guess what? In this bundle of nerves, we're going to have some motor nerves. We're using green. We're going to have some motor nerves from the brain out to the heart. Can I make it bigger? But in that same pathway, in that same bundle, we happen to have a sensory nerve from the jaw back up. So it's the same bundle, but because we have two nerves very close to each other, the brain can sometimes get confused. So we have a sensory nerve from the jaw, and we have a motor nerve going out to the heart. Well, they're so close in the brain that our brain sometimes mistakes one for the other. That's what referred pain is. The painful sensory nerve, because the pain is coming from the sensory nerves, right? The painful sensory nerves just happen to be right beside a motor nerve from somewhere else. So our brain can get confused, and that's why we have referred pain. The pain feels like it's coming from your shoulder. It just happens to be right next to a nerve going to your heart. Or it could also be, yeah, we'll leave it at that. All right, folks, that's it. If you have any questions, let me know. Great job.